Good morning.
I'd like to preface this by saying, as I said in my announcements at the first service, I really wasn't, I think that our ability to forgive is so intertwined with God's forgiveness of us and God's empowerment that it's really hard to think what should be, which should come first. But I thought that if we move from us forgiving others and then to God's forgiveness of us, it would work well with the Lenten progression. So that's what I've done. So you have a handout that has a lot of what I've gathered about forgiveness over time, and I also would love it if you have anything you'd like to add. I'd love to hear it. So the first thing is, what does forgiveness mean? One might think of it as being nice. It's important to forgive. Maybe you learned that in Sunday school and Girl Scouts. It's a polite thing to do. It's something that good people do. It does keep open communication with people. It keeps social interaction moving. But in order to do that, sometimes to do something that may be a more superficial forgiving of others without kind of plumbing the depths of ourselves, we might minimize our hurt. We might just think that we can gloss over something that's happened to us. And I think when we forgive is a matter of being nice. Often that's what we're doing. So then what's the difference between forgiveness and being polite? I think the kind of forgiveness that is what we're talking about today is far more than being polite. It's about acknowledging that we've been hurt, that something has happened to us that's painful, and then working to be able to let go of our pain and our suffering. We always experience tough moments, and I think if forgiveness is a matter of being nice, sometimes we aren't really acknowledging that maybe the person who we're forgiving wasn't particularly nice in their intent to us. And that's the way the world is. Everybody is not always, it's not always that someone made a mistake or not always that someone was having a bad day. And regardless of what someone else's presumption of what someone else's feelings are, actually that's not really so important as our ability to forgive them. Sometimes we can, when things are very, very difficult, in order to live our lives, we can deny how hard it is. In situations of abuse, where something is continual, where it builds from an apology and things get more and more and more tense until there's a blow-up and people are hurt, and then a request for forgiveness, and then it builds again and again. People who are enmeshed in that kind of a relationship can diminish their hurt and diminish their pain because they don't know a way out. But you can say it's not that important. We can deny the reality of its recurrence and that it's a pattern. And sometimes we can put up with a very difficult situation because we're afraid of the consequences of moving out of it, or we don't want to acknowledge how much we're being hurt by it. So forgiveness requires that we acknowledge that we've been hurt, that we feel the hurt, that we allow ourselves to feel that we've been hurt and that we're angry. To forgive means to let go. And when we forgive someone else, when we are hurt, when we're aware of being hurt and angry at people, hold resentment towards people, it's as if we're carrying a backpack with rocks on our back. And to be able to forgive someone is to put that down, perhaps to put it at the foot of the cross, but to loose the ropes that tie that burden that we're carrying around to us. To let go of the past. We can't really turn towards the future until we've let go of the past. and have released ourselves from its burden upon us. And the more serious the incident, the more important it is that we forgive. But it's important to not acknowledge also that if we, people say forgive and forget. Well, to forgive is not to forget. To forgive is to take the burden upon us off us. But if forgetting would mean that then we would allow ourselves to be put in a dangerous situation again, that's not part of forgiving. That's not what's asked of us. What's asked of us is to let go of the burdens that prevent us from moving into the future, to let go of the claim that others have on us before we forgive them. And to forgive ourselves is not to place ourselves in a place of vulnerability again. So forgiveness is not dismissing the hurt, shrugging it off. Forgiveness is not condoning. I think sometimes we don't want to forgive because we think someone should be punished for what they did. And by us holding our anger is a way of in our minds, of having someone be punished for what they did. Forgiveness is not reconciliation. And some people will say that's the case, but I don't believe that. I think it doesn't mean that then you have to be able to be cordial to that person when you see them, although that certainly is a very powerful benefit if it's possible, but not a requirement. Forgiveness is a decision not to seek revenge and not to nurse a grudge. When we forgive so that we can have inner healing and so that we can go on with our lives and we can face the future and not be tied down by the past. Forgiveness is a gift of God to us and from us to others. And in a way, our ability to forgive is God's love flowing through us. People who learn to forgive are usually people who realize how forgiven they are. And I think there's a great humility in being able to forgive and being able to acknowledge that we all need God's forgiveness. Forgiveness is a fresh act that's added to the acts of the past. The past isn't altered or the consequences changed. But as I said, our burden is released. I came across something by the... Go on.
I had a question about the last bullet. People who learn to forgive are usually people who realize how forgiven they are. And you mentioned, somebody brought up last week forgiveness of self.
Right, that's later on.
Okay,
But yes,
okay.
I mean, that's important,
Okay.
and it's all, I think, to me, it's all of a whole.
Right, I'm going to ask how
You
that
know.
fit into that last bullet. It's on the next page. Okay.
Yes, okay, yeah,
As long as she opened the door to the bullets.
sure.
I want to ask you about the third one down. Forgiveness is not reconciliation. I think of that word when we're angry and in an unforgiving relationship vis-a-vis someone else, we're also out of sync with our relationship with God.
Right,
So I think it's reconciliation to the extent that it's reconciliation with God.
absolutely.
It doesn't mean that you're restoring a relationship with the person who wronged you necessarily.
Right, although it can mean that, and at
It
its
can
best
mean
it does, but
It
it's
can
not a
mean that.
requirement.
Right.
Yeah. And as I was beginning to say, and I appreciate your comments, I came across an article by the Mayo Clinic staff about forgiveness, and also one by a doctor about forgiveness, far more than I came across religious ones about forgiveness, which is interesting. But the Mayo Clinic says, what are the benefits of forgiving someone? Letting go of grudges and bitterness can make way for compassion, kindness, and peace. Forgiveness can lead to healthier relationships, greater spiritual and psychological well-being, less anxiety, stress, and hostility, because I think anxiety is something that bleeds into other areas of our life. We are not able to just limit it to one relationship or one situation, as does hostility. It leads to lower blood pressure, fewer symptoms of depression, because holding it all in causes depression, and a lower risk of alcohol and substance abuse, which is, I would think, would come when you're self-medicating, when you are using drugs or alcohol to take away pain. So then, if we turn the page, what stands in the way of forgiveness? sometimes we can carry a burden for so long that it really becomes part of who we are. And in that case, if we let go of our anger and our pain, then who are we? And I think we've all known people for whom recovery from an illness, a long-standing illness, can be very difficult. Wonderful, exciting, but difficult at many levels because you have to redefine who you are. And the same thing that letting go of the burden of anger and hostility and resentment can sometimes lead us to have to redefine who we are in that new situation, in that new way of being. And if we let our suffering define our world, what will it be if we are healed? Waiting for a sign of repentance. What stands in the way of forgiveness? One thing is waiting for a sign of repentance on the part of the other person. If they're not going to give an inch, why in the world should I? And for some kind of step, some indication from them that even that they know they've hurt us can be in the way of us trying to forgive someone. And also, it was interesting, when I was a curate in a parish, there was a Jewish man who came to church every week with his wife, who was Episcopalian, and their children. They had many children. They'd adopted children. They'd had foster children. They had their own children. And they all were growing up as Episcopalians. And he came every week. And he did a series on forgiveness. And he was right along the Christian line, which I found very interesting until he got to the part where he said that in his understanding from his Jewish childhood and his life, he was still a Jew. There was no doubt about that, that someone had to come to you and ask for your forgiveness before you gave it. And our approach is different. Our approach is that we forgive others whether they ask or not. And as we were going back to the earlier parts of this forum series, Jesus says to forgive ultimately an infinite number of times. And that is one way in which one of the many ways in which Jesus kind of changed the culture of his day. What stands in the way of forgiveness? Defining forgiveness as requiring repentance by the other or a resumption of a relationship. Difficulty in acknowledging our mistakes, being harder on ourselves than we would be with others who we care about. If you love your neighbor as yourself, how much do you love yourself? And can you forgive yourself for things that we've done, especially if we've contributed to something that has, where we want to forgive someone else. And that's another way that God's forgiveness is so intertwined with our ability to forgive others. And maybe we're afraid of being hurt again. And if we carry this burden, if we carry our anger, if we carry resentment, then we won't open ourselves to being hurt again. So, and I read a wonderful quote, I think, forgiveness and time are inextricably linked. It is easier to forgive after a little time has gone by. And I read in a wonderful book about, can you forgive too soon? And you can forgive too soon. You can forgive too soon if the forgiveness, therefore, is going to be a superficial one because you haven't really thought about what happened and what it meant to you. And in one of the rites of reconciliation in the prayer book, which is when you come to a priest and you talk with the priest about your sins and ask for advice. That's the main difference between what we do on a Sunday morning. In there it says, and I have forgiven those or forgiven others. And there was a time in my life when it was very difficult for me to forgive a certain situation. And the priest that I went to for confession said to me, just say, I hope to be able to forgive them, or I pray to be able to forgive them. A real acknowledgement that it's just not a switch we can turn, but that a deep and lasting forgiveness comes when we have really thought about it, and when we have moved through a process so that we can forgive. And I also have found that sometimes you can forgive someone, but then after a while the anger comes back again. And then you forgive them again. And then the anger comes back again. And it's a process that repeats itself. It doesn't mean what we've done is wrong. It just means we need to attend to it more fully. and it doesn't mean we can't forgive them. It just means that we need a little more time. And I found these, and actually, Not Forgiving Too Soon came from a book, Don't Forgive Too Soon, that sadly I lent to someone. You know, in the way that happens. I hope that they're enjoying it, but I don't have it back. And I think I need to order it again. It's an incredible book. And Dennis Lynn and Matthew Lynn I think Matthew Lynn, I don't know if they're alive, but Matthew Lynn was a Jesuit. His brother was a Jesuit who left the order and married. And they wrote this book, Don't Forgive Too Soon, Extending the Two Hands That Heal. And if you look at this chart, I think it's quite interesting. It follows along the Kubler-Ross stages of accepting death. And I'm aware that we don't all move through those stages. People who are moving towards death don't all move through those stages in order. But ultimately, hopefully move through them all to get to a point of acceptance. So when people are approaching death, one of the stages is denial. I don't ever admit I'm dying. And in forgiveness is, I don't admit I was hurt. Anger, it's their fault that I'm dying. In forgiveness, it's their fault that I'm hurt, which may be very true, is true, but that it's a step. Bargaining, I set up conditions to be fulfilled before I'm ready to die. I set up conditions to be fulfilled before I'm ready to forgive. Depression, it's my fault that I'm dying, it's my fault that I'm hurt. And I think that's one of the real issues in people who are in situations that are repetitive, where they're abusive, where there is continual hurt. People can sometimes be led to believe that it's their fault they're being hurt, or if they're being abused, if they're being beaten, that it's their fault. And it's important to move beyond that. And then also to move to acceptance. I look forward to death, bringing release from the hurt of dying, and hopefully moving to everlasting life and life with God. And I look forward to growth from the hurt. And I think that that is the time when we've really turned the corner, when we can look at the situation we were in, what we've lived through, and acknowledge how we've grown through it, and how perhaps we've grown through being able to forgive. And then the last thing is what I hope I said also at the beginning. Ultimately, God is deeply involved in our desire and ability to forgive. We are forgiven, we forgive. We pray to be able to forgive, because I think God grants us the grace and the ability to forgive others when we might think we could never do it. And also, I think that it's very important to pray for the people who've hurt us. It changes relationships. It changes, it's extraordinary the change that it can bring about. And again, not necessarily saying that we would re-enter a relationship that hurt us, but we can, after we've forgiven people, restore relationships. We can move to new places with people with whom we've had very difficult times. And that's our goal. Yes?
Would you address the distinction between forgiving someone in the heart and forgiving them in words?
Well, I think that I would say that that's what I was talking about when I was talking about kind of a more superficial forgiveness. I think when we have moved to a point where we can see how we've grown, how we've grown from it, is a sign that we've forgiven them in our heart. Do you have something? Why don't you add to that what I've said?
Does it require forgiving them in words directed to them?
I don't think so, because sometimes that can be an extraordinary thing. And we read about people who have called people years after a very difficult situation occurred and have asked for forgiveness. It is a very powerful thing, and that's actually from the other side than what I'm talking about. But it can change people's lives totally when that happens. And if we have been, in a lot of situations, we do have something to do with. And if we can ask people to forgive us, it can be extraordinary. And I think that that movement would also have to come from a forgiveness in the heart. Is that?
I guess I was asking a question about, do I approach someone who has hurt me and say to them, I forgive you for having hurt me in this way?
That's something one can do. You know, I think it depends. It may or may not restore a relationship depending upon whether they think they've hurt you or whether they can take responsibility for what you suffered. You know. Other comments? Yes.
And if they're deceased?
Well, I think in prayer we can do that. I think in prayer we can, in prayer we can ask other people for forgiveness, but we can also forgive people who've died, because it's really a matter of us being able to forgive them rather than for us going to them and them thanking us for forgiving them. You know, it's really an internal, personal thing to forgive someone. Yes?
Well, I kind of empathize with the Jewish man that hoping for a real interchange with the other person, and
Right.
you know, that's
You hope for that, yes.
yeah,
Of
and
course.
Feel it'd be very hard to really forgive unless they step up. You know.
Well, I think that can be the case. You know, absolutely. I think it's helpful to us if we can do it whether or not they step up. You know. And I think God wants us to be whole and healed. You know. Yes.
I'm concerned about the potential for forgiveness of an act that is truly wrong, such as the soldier who killed 16 Afghani. And then his supporters in this country saying he was such a good guy. Now, I can't forgive him for killing 16 Afghani. I can acknowledge that he's a good guy, or had been. But I don't know what our government should do for this guy.
Yeah. I kind of think that, and this is me speaking personally, and a lot of this is me speaking personally, but I think that that I leave punishment to God in my relationships with people, you know, personally, and I think that's one way that it's easier for me to forgive them. But also I think that what I'm talking about is interpersonal forgiveness,
Yes,
people, and I think that, but when I talked other weeks about forgiveness between countries, sometimes it is helpful when we are seeking to forgive someone, and I think we need to be seeking to forgive people, is to understand the context of their lives, the context of their lives. It's not, I don't think it's valuable to make excuses for people, but I don't think that, I think sometimes it's very hard for us to understand why someone does something like that, but sometimes there are reasons. I don't know if that answers your question. And I think our ability to forgive is something we work out, and it's often between ourselves and God, you know, whether we do or don't forgive. Yes?
I may not be, people may disagree with me on this, but I think forgiveness is tied in a lot with sin. And I think the example that Joe just gave, we don't believe in sin, a lot of us don't believe in sin anymore. And therefore we justify what people do because he was a pretty good guy, or because he had a bad childhood, or for what reason or another. That may be all true, but if we recognize that we sin,
Right.
we
We
then
do.
it becomes easier for me to forgive, to recognize I also sin
Right.
too.
Yeah. Very
And,
true.
and to actually recognize that we are all capable of evil.
Right.
Not,
Yeah.
it's more than just, a bad childhood.
Right, right. And and that's what I think that's where I was going, and I appreciate your words very much, but I think that's where I was going when I was talking about making excuses for people in a way, because that's something personally I've done a good deal of in my life. But I think it's really important to understand that we are created with the ability to choose between good and evil, and it's within us. It's not that there is a force out there that we are struggling against. In the Episcopal Church, we believe it's right here inside ourselves, and we all sin. We all do things that are wrong. We all do things we wish we hadn't done. Sometimes we hurt people and we don't know we've hurt them, and sometimes we've hurt them a lot without knowing we've hurt them. And I do think that does go away towards enabling us to forgive others, to realize that we are all sinners, and we all need to seek forgiveness.
Forgive us, Relaine.
No, that's fine. There are 2 seats down here if you'd like them. Yes, and I hope this can be a conversation. I'm not interested in being the one pontificating up here, because I think that we bring many perspectives to this. Yes?
Just a follow-up to Chick's question, which is a very good question, a cautionary note about forgiving someone from something in the past, and it brings to mind a situation many years ago in which I was at a parish retreat. I have absolutely no idea, recollection, what that parish retreat was about, what we talked about, what we did, who even was there, except one detail, and that was during the retreat, someone in the group, we must have been talking about forgiveness, someone in the group announced that he would forgive me for something I had done to him. I was utterly stunned. I had absolutely no idea that I had hurt this person. I considered him a friend. I was so stunned by that that is the only thing I remember from that retreat.
Right.
And maybe I need to forgive him for having forgiven me for something that I didn't know I'd done. I don't know. I'm still carrying it. It's the only thing I remember.
Right. So just in case people can't hear.
Absolutely stunning.
Yeah. Tom was saying that he was on a retreat and he can't remember much of anything about the retreat except it was about forgiveness, and in it, someone who was a friend of his said that he had forgiven him for something he had done that he was totally unaware had had any impact, or that he'd done at all, perhaps. And he was saying perhaps he needs to forgive him for making that the only thing he remembers from the retreat. But it does show how really damaged and hurt we can be by things that sometimes people do not even realize they've done. And also that sometimes something like that done privately is far more effective than done publicly. Right? Yes.
I really welcome putting all this together on one page. And it's rich, and especially the point that sometimes, even if one gets to the point where one can forgive, and even from one's heart, the relationship is not going to be the same as it was.
Right.
That's,
Right.
and maybe it's subject of another such forum, but keeping social interaction open raises for me the question of anger and how we use it, or manage it, or express it. If I were to do a bumper sticker for cars, it would be "Tussle we must."
Right.
Sometimes you need to tussle it through.
Right.
And some of those wonderful books that I'm indebted to psychologists for, such as How to Talk So Children Will Listen, How to Listen So Children Will Talk. In one of those is this wonderful example of the mother who walks into the bathroom and finds that her 15-year-old has again left the wet bath towel on the floor. And the author goes on to say, what I had to say to my child was, I need to tell you that I was so angry when I saw that towel on the floor that I could have thrown all your clothes out the window. Now, that's not a threat, but I need to have you know that I felt that kind of
Right, the level of your anger.
And I'm not blaming you for what I feel, but I need to let you know that's where I am. And that sort of looking at the quality of sort of social interaction around anger and how it's used or managed in such a way that it leads toward not further estrangement, but further
Right.
intimacy.
Right.
That whole interaction piece is a big one.
Right, yeah, Al was talking about, what's the name of the book again?
Well, one was How to Talk So Children Will Listen,
How to
and
Talk
How
So
to Listen So Children Will Talk.
How to Talk So Children Will
That
Listen.
goes back a few
How to
years,
listen
but a
so-
lot of my things go back a few years.
Children will talk, yes. And how, how a mother might say to their child when, once again, they have left the wet towel on the bathroom floor, your doing that has made me, and you can correct my language if it's incorrect, has made me so angry that I feel like I would like to throw all of your clothing out the window.
Well, I have gotten so angry.
I've gotten so
better than
angry.
you made me.
Right,
Which only aggravates the guilt, which
Yeah.
aggravates the anger itself.
So I've gotten so angry rather than you made me so angry. I could take some lessons probably.
I think.
But the
I'm not saying I
idea
do
is that, yeah, the idea, right, the idea is speaking in ways so people can hear you, which is an important thing to be able to develop some skill at, right? And also to try to communicate in ways, especially in the moment, that keeps communication open rather than shutting it down. Yes.
In the workplace where things become competitive between people, and when things, positions above you are opening up, and you and somebody else, or maybe 2 or 3 people,
Right.
would like to be in that, get to that position.
Yes.
And things, sometimes these people who are competing do things against
Right.
the other,
Sabotage other people.
and you feel, well, I can forgive them, but the things keep going and going and
I
going.
mean, the impact of what people do.
And things behind your back that you're not aware of.
Right.
And all of a sudden, from a different angle, you're getting
Right.
flat.
Yes. Yes.
And,
You were talking
how
about-
how did that happen? Oh, it goes back to that person.
Right. Right. Ways in the workplace that you can trace things that have an impact on your really ability to to fulfill your ability to do your work come from other people sabotaging it. I think that's very difficult. And it can be understood, and perhaps that enables people to understand in the way that people do good and evil in a way that might enable us to forgive them. But it can have long-lasting implications, right? Yes. Did you want to say something?
Well, I was going to say, Al's comment about parent and teenager, which we probably all experience, creates some difficult situations because there's intimacy involved in a parent-child relationship.
Right.
And trust, too, that has to be there on both sides. But I'm thinking, and would be interested in your comment or others, about situations like the abusive husband
Right.
who apologizes frequently
Yes.
to a mate for his abusiveness.
Right.
And yet, in that relationship in which trust is implicit,
You mean the
the wife
marital
probably
relationship?
knows it's going to continue.
Right.
And how does one deal with that situation?
Yeah, I had hoped to be addressing that in part of what I said here. That, and I think it's really important because it is a cycle that repeats itself. Abusive relationships, physical abuse, emotional abuse. And it can be between, often it is between a husband and wife. It can exist in other relationships as well. And it's a cycle that can be identified that starts with, well, I don't know where it starts, but it has building tension. Things are calm, things are great. There's building tension, and then there's a blow-up. And often the person who is abused is blamed for the blow-up. And then when that occurs, people are physically abused, people are hit, people are hurt, or verbally abused. And then after that, the person who is the abuser is repentant, wants to be forgiven, brings flowers, says it will never happen again. And then they are forgiven, and then the tension begins to build again. And those are the kind of situations, I think, where you need to get other people's help to remove yourself from the situation. And there are places to go, and there are ways to, there are houses to be in where no one knows where you are. I mean, there are ways to pull yourself out of that situation, and then to work with people to create a new life and to do everything possible to distance the abuser from you. And those are the situations where you don't want to say all is forgiven, I'm going to re-enter this relationship. Those are the situations where you may forgive them, but there is no requirement that you place yourself in a situation where you may be harmed again. And I think it's really important to recognize that it is a cycle, and that it's not that once it's happened a few times, it's not likely that the desire for forgiveness is going to end it, that it will keep happening again and again. And, people who are abusers can get counseling, but often those relationships still need to be ended. And maybe some of you who are more involved in that, if that's not correct, please tell me, but I think that that's the situation. Yes?
Hi, my name is Susan Brown. I think this has just been so helpful to see these papers, this information. I was in an abusive relationship many, many, many years ago, and for years I had a lot of anger and resentment. And it wasn't until this person died, and I got out of it, but it wasn't until the person died that I was really able to forgive. And it just became crystal clear to me that this is not the same thing as someone saying something to upset you. This person is sick. And it's, I think important to,
So saying,
that person
understanding
has an
the person
illness.
was sick.
So it's not the same thing as someone who, oh, I'm sorry, I took your parking spot, I'm sorry, it's, but I agree with what you're saying, it's important to get out of that relationship
Right.
and get help, but I do think it's important to forgive because to recognize that a normal, healthy person wouldn't do those things.
Right, so you found understanding that there was illness there.
Right. But they still get out.
Yes, it was
But-
still important to get out, but understanding there was illness there ultimately let you be released from the burden
Right.
of carrying around your anger and your frustration. Yes.
And then I just want to say one other thing is that it can be too soon to forgive, but I don't think it's too late. I just wanted to share a simple story. When I was in 5th grade, I bullied a classmate who was new in the
You
school.
did what?
I bullied a
Bullied,
classmate.
yes.
Teased him because he had red hair and he was new.
Right.
And he had a lot of freckles. I think it was 40 years later. It was a little over 10 years ago. Anyway, we were getting ready to have a high school reunion. And I always remembered that I did that. And I apologized to him, and he accepted my apology
How lovely.
and said it meant a lot to him. And I share that story with my kids because I want them to know, like this other gentleman said, anyone is capable of doing
Absolutely.
something. It's not that the bullies are all the bad people and everyone else is good. Right?
Absolutely.
It's not black and
Right.
white.
Yeah.
And they said, oh, you apologized that late? I said, yes, and it was important to him. And then
Right.
he died suddenly 2 years later.
Yeah, so is
So
it
I'm
wonderful
so
you
glad
had the
that I had
opportunity?
Yeah, that's
Right?
right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes.
I think one of the keys, one of the difficulties for me in forgiving is the hurt that I have sustained. And I find that sometimes leads to anger that I repress, but it's the hurt that kind of is the start off of the problem.
Right.
So I needed to forgive someone with whom, it was a very long-standing thing. And actually, Mary Lee did a quiet morning or two, or an evening in the morning, an extended one. on forgiveness, and one of the Bible verses that she offered to get us thinking, I think it's Ephesians, where it talks about God can do infinitely more than all we can ask or imagine.
Yes.
And in thinking about the hurt, I thought, well, what would I like God to do about that? Well, obviously I'd like God to take that away. And then it occurred to me that, well, that is what Jesus does for us. So as part of that sacrament of reconciliation, which concluded the retreat,
Right.
I literally asked Jesus to stand in my place and take the pain. And it worked.
Wonderful.
It worked.
Wonderful. One thing that also someone said to me once is that if you have painful times in your life, just kind of going off what you're saying, Jesus standing in your place and taking the pain, is to imagine, go back to that, what's on the top of your mind, and imagine that Jesus is standing beside you. And what would Jesus say in that situation? And it's very helpful, healing. But I think that's how God and Jesus, and the grace that God gives us are also intertwined. It's hard to separate them out. Thank you. Yes.
And when you interact with somebody in one of these situations, maybe not one of the most severe ones, but I think that hopefully you're really helping the other person too, that maybe they have an inkling that something was wrong.
Right.
And that, it relieves them as well.
Right. Yes. Yes. I think that's very true. Yes. Well, let's go with Edith first, and then.
Okay. Everybody is aware of alcohol causing problems when it's abused.
Right.
But when I was 26, I was taken off of caffeine because I was suffering from paroxysmal tachycardia. And every once in a while, if I've stayed up too long or worked too hard, I will still go back to the caffeine. And it wasn't too long ago, it was when my brother was visiting. I had 2 cups of strong tea, and my defenses were down, and one of, I guess it was my sister-in-law, who brought up politics, and I got so angry. Oh, I just lost it. I screamed, and I tried to apologize, but they wouldn't. They said, no, it's all right, it's all right, it's all right. But I knew it wasn't all right. But God taught me something by that. He really did, because people think I'm a goody two-shoes. But if you give me too much coffee, I'm not a goody two-shoes.
Thank you. Yes.
I had, being a freelance consultant most of my life after I left the music business, I came in contact with some really interesting people. And one was, I was hired to manage a startup business in New York that was owned by a group of well-to-do people in Boston. Many of them were well-known. One day I got a hurry-up call. There's a special board meeting in Boston, so I flew up to learn that the president had diverted the corporate money, most of it, into his own account.
Yeah, so there'd been some embezzlement there.
And the chairman looked at him and said, that's really unseemly. And I sat there. It cost me a lot of money personally.
Right.
I sat there with that word unseemly bouncing around in my head.
Right.
And of course he's right. And I started thinking of A.E. Housman and a poem about the young men going off to fight World War I.
Right. Yes, Houseman's poem about World War I. Yeah.
Think no more, lad. Laugh and be be jolly. Why should men make haste to die, you know, think no more, and then move on. And I felt better.
So the poem helped you be able to move on.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. Well, I think there are many ways in which we can be motivated to do that. And I think God's involved in that too.
Two of my former clients still owe me money, but one disappeared. Don't know where he is. The other went to Danbury, Connecticut for 3 years to a federal prison.
Yeah, yeah.
And it was a challenge not to feel good about his pain.
Right, not to exult in someone's suffering when they've wronged you.
And again, move on.
Right, yeah, yeah. I think that moving on is forgiveness and moving on are intertwined. But when we do the work of forgiveness, then the moving on is really a restoration to health. Yeah, we don't have much time. Yes?
I was just going to say, listening to that, I think seeking forgiveness is also that part of restoration.
Seeking forgiveness
Seeking forgiveness for the wrongs that we have done.
from other people?
Yeah, that the idea of asking, of reaching a point of being able to ask forgiveness allows for moving on.
Right, reaching a
Because I
point of
think we
being
can be
able to
stuck in
ask for
guilt
forgiveness.
as
Yes,
well as easily as being stuck in anger.
right,
And
right. Well, and that's part of acknowledging that we're not perfect people, right. Well, I really appreciate everything that everybody said, and thank you so much for all of your contributions. And then next week, we'll talk about forgiveness from God, and which is very important. And as I said, intertwined in this. And also I'm not quite decided about the Right One service, but at the second service, we're going to do a liturgy of forgiveness that offers people an opportunity to participate if they want to or not in just a very simple act showing God that you're asking to be forgiven, and some time to think about it. It's hard to talk, it's hard to explain, but I hope that will hold meaning for you. I've found in the past that it does for people. So I hope to see you again at 9:15 or whenever you can get here. Thank you.